Good morning. I'm just waking up here. This is going to be going through all of my tanning books, different styles of tanning and skin working and skin related stuff, and telling you about them, maybe making some recommendations and unrecommendations and stuff like that. First of all, let's start with, there's a lot of pamphlets that are kind of small. I think this is the same thing that's reprinted by the government, USDA. You can read these online for free now, I think. They're okay. There's some good information, but they're of limited use because there just isn't that much information. It's not that you couldn't eventually figure out tanning and learn to tan from them, but they leave much to be desired. Let's just say that. For instance, let's take a look in here at so let's say for buckskin in this book, this is the buckskin section of this book. Now I wrote a book on buckskin this thick for a reason. It doesn't have to be this thick, but I think you get the point on making buckskin, you know, not all the rest of the stuff that's going to be in this book. And then for those traditional methods like brain tanning and bark tanning, you'll find mention of them in books like this. This is ELLSWORTH JAEGER. So here's his section on how to make buckskin. I mean, it's got these great cute illustrations. And this is longer than usual, but it's still, you know, only this long. That's just really not enough. Kephart also has like a little section on buckskin, but it's just not that useful really. Because tanning is a journey. You know, you need to learn all this different stuff about the tools and stuff. You just can't learn it in that quick. So there's a lot of books like this too, the more modern books, which concentrate generally on other methods than the natural traditional methods that I use. So that's important to remember in this whole conversation and me showing you these books. That's all I care about. I don't care about tanning with acid, battery acid, or something you buy in a bottle or anything like that. I'm interested in stuff where I can gather everything or make everything. You know, I can gather bark, I can make smoke, I can get brains, I can burn my own lime. The bark tanning section, for instance, in this is a page and a half long, and that just isn't, you know, it isn't that much to go on. So these books are of limited use to me, and often they try to cover too much, you know, too many different methods in a small book. So let's talk about the books I do like. Now this one was written by my teacher's teacher, basically. So my friend Jim Riggs had met this guy, Buckskin Slim, in the 70s. Went and learned to tan from him at his cabin in the woods, and subsequently he bugged Buckskin Slim to write this book. And this is on the dry scrape method. You make a frame and you string the hide in the frame, you let it dry, and then you scrape it with a sharp tool like this. It kind of looks like an adze. And you dry scrape off the hair and this outside layer of skin. And then you soak it in brains and you soften it and then you smoke it. So this is a cool book. It's not as in-depth as some of the other books. It was one of the earliest books on brain tan buckskin. That was actually a whole book on that. It may even have been the first, although Larry Bellitz's book, Brain Tanning the Sioux Way, which I can't find unfortunately because that was an early book that a lot of people learned stuff from. It's more of a pamphlet. I mean, I think it's smaller than this book. It's definitely was influential, and I imagine that's still in print somewhere. But it's also on the dry scrape method. So that's a really cool book. I'm lucky to have that. Jim Riggs gave it to me. I think it may still be in print though. I think someone might have reprinted it. So then, not too long after that, Jim wrote his book. And this is the first edition that Jim gave me, which I just keep because it's, you know, for the archives. And this is the second edition. It's a little bit expanded and rewritten. So Jim's teachers were Slim and Sonny, and these guys were buddies, and they both, you know, lived in cabins near each other in the woods and brain tanned, and they taught Jim how to brain tan. This is a great book, and this copy I got from Doug Elliott, a storyteller and naturalist in North Carolina. Great guy. He's got, you know, a little bit of a web presence and some great books. Anyway, I met him and visited him at his house in North Carolina, and he was selling this book, and I was like a broke kid, and I talked him into selling it to me for cost. And I remember he was real hesitant, but he did it, and good for him because, boy, I put it to good use in, you know, multiple ways. Not only, you know, eventually becoming a teacher of this stuff, but using this book myself. I mean, look how dog-eared. You can see the spot where, you know, my dirty fingers were turning the pages. probably with wet, wet hands while I was trying to tan something and looking things up. I've read this book over and over and over and over and over and over. I was reading it over and over before I even started tanning. It's funny, well written, excellent diagrams. There's a lot of Jim and this book in my book and my writing, both in style, thoroughness, the illustrations. Anyway, he was a good friend and an amazing man. For dry scrape buckskin, this is my #1 recommendation, hands down, and it is still in print, just not in this version. As far as I know, the next book was John and Jerry McPherson's Braintan Buckskin. This is also, again, on the dry scrape method. It's small, but their point was to keep it small and make it as quick and accessible as possible and get people making buckskin as quickly as possible. So while it's a small book, it does work. Now that, I believe, is reprinted in here. I don't know if it's exactly the same or changed, but this book also has a lot of other stuff that's very useful and interesting, kind of primitive survival skills. Cordage, rawhide, stone tools, fire, making bows, all kinds of stuff. These were friends of mine. Okay, so all those previous books on brain tanning were about dry scraping, and none of those people were wet scrape brain tanners. And there would occasionally be like a small mention of wet scraping, but it just was something that was pretty uncommon. I was introduced to the idea of wet scraping from one of Jim's students, who was really my first teacher. So I was sort of a student of Jim through her first, I guess you would say. And she was an important teacher of mine and a real good friend. And anyway, I was really interested in wet scrape for various reasons. One is I always like to work on things that need work, that no one else is doing. Bark tanning was really rare. Wet scrape brain tanning was really rare. And I just wasn't meeting people who did wet scrape brain tan. So I started trying it, and it was hard to learn. Like, I was screwing up all over the place trying to figure this thing out. As simple as it seems, But I just kept persisting at that, and then I met, Melvin Beatty, and there's a picture of him in here. This is Jim Riggs and Larry Dean Olson. Both of these guys are super influential in the primitive skills type of movement. And Larry wrote this book, Outdoor Survival Skills. There's Slim and Sunny again. My teacher, my original teacher, who was Jim's student. And this is Melvin Beatty, who was my main influence for wet scraping. That's him wrapped in a brain tanned buffalo robe. And anyway, I met him at the Glass Buttes Nappin', and he showed me his buckskin, and it was amazing. I was like, wow, like I want to make that. That's what I've been chasing after. And just the few tips he gave me over the next, year or two really made it work, made it start working. So I just perceived a real need for a book on wet scrape brain tanning because I was sold on it. I liked it better for numerous reasons. It's not that it's just better across the board, not at all. There's pros and cons, but when it came down to the product, I liked the product better. This is my ex-wife Tamara that I wrote this book with. She's scraping off this grain layer on the beam like that, and then demonstrating here how you do it in dry scrape. So being the super geek that I am, I did research and experiments and just tanned a lot of hides. We used to tan hides and sell them. Basically spent, after doing a lot of tanning for a few years, wet scrape brain tanning, we spent about a year writing this book. That's almost all we did for a year. Probably the longest, most thorough book on home tanning in existence, especially considering that it covers just basically one topic. We wanted it to cover the basic process and be a long-term reference that you could keep coming back to get new ideas. Because we were thinking, people, if we did all this research too, which I'll talk about in a minute, but we figured, people can take what we've gone up to this point and then they can take it further and use some of the other research we found and, suggested experiments and stuff and take off with it. Most people are not that kind of people. They just want to follow directions and do something the same over and over again, which is why progress is slow. And that's okay. People are just different. That's just how I am, I guess. So anyway, this is the first edition of the book. We later renamed it because we thought this title was cool. This is basically influenced by reading old technical manuals from the turn of the century and back, mostly maybe from like the 40s and back. And we thought this was just the coolest title ever. But we weren't really thinking of the broader audience. So eventually we changed the title to this. did a minor revision, very little revision, and right now we're working on the next revision of this, which will be a little more thorough, and that'll be published in digital and print versions whenever that happens. So as much as I'd like to be promoting this book right now, it is not available yet, and it's out of print. You can find copies, but they're usually, you know, $40 and up, over $40, and you might as well just wait for the new version. This is Matt Richards. He was dry scraping, and he'd learned from Jim Riggs, I believe, and he was actually producing a lot of hides. He was producing buckskin to sell and stuff, and every time I'd see him for what seemed like years, I mean, you know, the memory's hazy or whatever, I was bugging him to try wet scrape brain tanning because I was sold on it, and I just wanted to, I was kind of always proselytizing about it and trying to get people to try it. And, you know, I'd show him my hides and be like, yeah, check it out, you should try it, you should try it. And so eventually he tried it and he switched to wet scrape brain tanning. So anyway, while we were writing our book, Matt stopped by and they were like, you know, let's write the book together maybe, like consider writing the book together. They wanted to make us that offer because they had decided they were going to write a book. And they had discovered information. We knew already that people used sometimes ashes or an alkali to soak the hide, which is a process called bucking. And he thought he would offer that because he was thinking about writing a book and didn't want to just write it while we were already writing one, that it might just work better to put everything into one book. We're already about halfway done, and I don't really play well with others anyway, so I was kind of like, no, that's not going to work, and I don't think it would have worked. And they actually started rushing this book out because they were afraid that we would take the market. You know, like our book would come out and then it would dominate the market and their book would kind of like flounder in its shadow. Well, it turned out to be the opposite, and they kind of rushed this book out right after ours. They've outsold us by a huge margin. It's a great cover, it's a great title, real catchy, and it's a little bit cheaper because it's smaller, and also from aggressive marketing, because they're aggressive marketers. They treated it like a business. Matt started braintan.com, which it kind of created a market, basically. If you look on Amazon, he has like over 100 reviews, and we have like 7 or something. People don't review books unless you ask them to, or you happen to have like a huge audience, and in this case, it was probably both. Now, these guys were real excited about using ashes because it made braining so much easier, and that was touted as one of the main benefits. From what I've gathered over time, that promise just didn't pan out. I don't know anyone that does bucking still that still uses ashes. They all use potassium hydroxide, which is a powder that you buy. You can get it from like a chemical supply house. So anyway, if you're interested in that method, this is the book. Otherwise, I would recommend my book more. All right, so continuing on with buckskin, what this is a Xerox print from a library of Arden Ross King's summary dissertation doctorate thesis on Aboriginal tanning in Western North America. So this is basically a book reviewing all the literature on Western tanning methods by natives. You know, it's of limited use to someone learning tanning, but to me it's fascinating. The problem is that these anthropologists collecting this information didn't know what they were looking at. They really didn't care to record the details in any kind of detail, because they just were recording it for posterity, and they're interested in like, the things they're interested in, like, oh, well, this group, you know, used this kind of rock, and so did that group, and that's interesting to them, you know, but actually doing this stuff is not really interesting to them. So they don't know what they're looking at because they're not tanners, and that's why experimental archaeology is so important. It's so that the people who are observing something and trying to record it know what they're looking at. And unfortunately, that's becoming more and more common, is this experimental archaeology. This kid, you know, just got into college, called me recently and wanted to know about burning lime because he found my stuff online, and he wanted to try it, you know. So, and this guy like flint knaps, and he makes, you know, atlatls and stuff like that because he wants to understand what he's studying, and that's how it should be. The more interesting stuff in here ended up getting incorporated into my book. In the back here, there's a thing called options. It's just like about different stuff we read about that would be cool to try, and I don't know where that section is, but somewhere in there. When we wrote our buckskin book, we went all over the place to different large libraries like San Jose and Berkeley, and we would spend, you know, a couple days in a library digging up these old references, looking at the references in one reference to find other references, just looking through random anthropology, material culture stuff from all over the place, from all over the world. So we Xeroxed all this stuff during that time. There's also a lot of stuff on leather chemistry, things like that. So mostly this is about traditional tanning in North America. You know, there's sections like the Arctic, Northwest Coast, California, Plateau, Plains. So there's a lot of real interesting stuff in here. And again, quotes and stuff from this information ended up in our book. You can read this online. This is A.B. Farnham. And he wrote several books, and he also had a trapping company, I think, that published a lot of other books on trapping and stuff like that. Anyway, this is his book on furs and skins. It's useful. It's not brain tanning really. I'm just kind of bridging the gap here. A lot of it's going to be alum tanning, using alum, which is called tawing, T-A-W-I-N-G. And that method is ancient. It goes back a long way, but it's not super common early on because alum isn't that common. You know, it occurs occasionally in deserts. It was used by the Egyptians. It may have been used by southwestern Indians, maybe. It's an interesting tan. It's really astringent. It's used for making pickles too, to keep them crunchy, but it'll shrink the hide up a lot. Okay, so let's move on to bark tanning. Well, to bridge between bark tanning and brain tanning, this is Lotta Ram's book. This is the original copy, which is translated from Swedish. She's Swedish, so she couldn't translate it herself. And she had this retranslated and expanded. So this is her next version. And it covers a lot of different methods. She's the real deal. And the book is very useful and it's very cool. And she is super cool. So Lotta has a small tannery where she produces leather and leather items for sale. So she's actually a practicing tanner. She has some cool history stuff here. She talks about some different methods from, you know, all over the world, basically, and different kinds of methods. She's just awesome. Unfortunately, it's rather expensive in the States. If you can find this copy a lot cheaper, which I doubt you can, it's probably actually more, you might consider this, but otherwise I would definitely go with the upgraded version. She's also very into tanning fish leather, which is really popular right now. This book is entirely on tanning fish skin. She has all these different species and like samples of the tanned skin down here. Really beautiful, well done book. Unfortunately, this is also quite expensive just because it's expensive to print books there and get them shipped over here. But if you want to tan fish skins, oh yeah, definitely get this book. So moving into bark tanning, like I said, these books cover a variety of traditional methods, but again, it's all the stuff I'm interested in, the traditional and natural tanning. So moving into just bark tanning, which is a main interest of mine, which is this. This is bark tan skin, and it can be tanned in a lot of different ways, you know, like let me grab a hide to show you. So this is a huge, you know, roll of leather, but it can be anything from this, like something you'd make a belt or a harness or a shoe out of, to softer leather like this. And all kinds of stuff in between. Just depends on the skin and the methods you use and stuff like that. So this is a free book you can read online, Home Tanning and Leather Making Guide. This also has other methods and stuff in it, but it does cover bark tanning. It's worth reading. Is it a great book or reference? Not really. It's a little bit short and cursory again. But it's free. You can read it online for free, and it's worth checking out. I have a book, you know, mostly written on that subject, but there's still just so much to do, and I can't pull it off on my own. So until I have help writing that book of some kind or a lot more energy, I'm not going to be able to pull it off, I don't think, which is unfortunate. This is where the good stuff is in old books like this. Actually, this one's not that great. I think it's a guy that put a patent on some kind of process, and he's trying to sell it to tanners or something like that. This used to be my favorite reference on bark tanning, which is Watts, The Art of Leather Manufacture. It's mostly on vegetable tanning, which is, you know, we say bark tanning usually, but vegetable tanning is the kind of the best technical term, and that doesn't refer to vegetables like broccoli. It just refers to the entire plant kingdom, which is the more archaic, you know, traditional use of vegetable. There's all kinds of stuff in here. This used to be my favorite book until I found out that a lot of the best stuff in here is taken from Deland, who is now my favorite reference. And that book, he was a French guy, I think in the 1700s, correct. And he was translated by this Irish Tanning Society into English, but he had traveled everywhere from, like, I guess Morocco to Northern Europe studying tanning, and he wrote exhaustively about it. He was a good writer, and he recorded things well. So this is where the good stuff is in these old books, and almost all of them can be read for free online. In fact, I've put together a folder of these books, and it's in, it's on a file server, and you can download it. I'm going to make that available to everyone because I spent a lot of time looking for this stuff, and I'm always telling tanners, it's like, no, go read this stuff. Like, this is where the good stuff is, and I honestly don't think a lot of people avail themselves of it. It's not, it requires a little bit of background. You kind of have to be a tanner to understand a lot of it and not just be completely overwhelmed. But that's where the good stuff is, so I'm going to make that available. I think I'll probably drive you to my website in the description of this video, and you can go there, and I'll have like a page maybe with reviews of these books or something like that. I'll see what I can pull off. And a link. Okay, let's try to finish this up. So I just have a few other books that are related to skin working, skins, tanning, and stuff like that. This is a really neat book. Is it a must read for most of you? No, definitely not. It's mostly tools, like traditional leatherworking tools. As you can see, there's a lot of pages from old catalogs with all these different crazy tools. Leatherworkers just had an amazing number of different tools for, like a shoemaker or fancy leatherworker would have access to all these different crazy tools, and like a whole pile of them often. It's kind of like if you're a carpenter and you want to do a bunch of fancy edge work, then, well, you need a bunch of router bits, or you need a bunch of plain bits that make all these different impressions and stuff like that. But for basic leather working, the number of tools you actually need isn't that much. But if you're making shoes, for instance, you might need one of these, which is a plier for stretching the leather over a shoe form. So the reason I really have this is because there's stuff on tanning tools, and it's not the majority of the book by far, but it's important stuff to me, and that's really the reason I have this. Now, this is not a how-to book. It's not, there's a lot of stuff that's missing, but it's hard to find this kind of reference with, these tools in it. So I would say, for most people, yeah, this is totally unnecessary. Here's a section on tanning. So they're talking about, like, this is a knife that's actually completely round, and has a handle in the middle that you grab and use it to scrape like this. Here's probably a thickness splitter. That talks about these graining boards. I learned about these from there. I learned about block knives from here. So it's a pretty neat book. If you're a total geek about this kind of stuff, you might want to pick it up, I guess. Here's a neat book on skin sewing. Secrets of Eskimo Skin Sewing. You can pick this up used here and there. Looks like a mouse chewed on it. If you're interested in that particular subject, This is the main book I learned glue making from. It's called Glue, Gelatins, Animal Charcoal, Phosphorus, Cements, Pastes, and Mucilages by DAWIDOWSKY. And this I found in a bookstore years ago, and I remember when I went to the counter and we bought it, the woman at the counter said, "Oh, good, this is going to a good home." And I'm like, you have no idea, lady, how good of a home this is going to. So this is where I learned most of what I know about glue cooking and hide glue right here, and there's a lot of other cool stuff in here too. I'm sure you can read this online for free. There's also at least one more major work on animal glue or making hide glue. Here's an interesting story. I actually got to see some of this leather, but unfortunately when my mom's ex died, someone got the pieces of leather from this, but they had this book, and his mom had bought, these coasters. They're like little, drink coasters. Otherwise I'd be using one here with my coffee. And the story is that this ship wrecked in the 1600s, 1700s, I think. And for a couple hundred years, this leather sat at the bottom of the ocean. It was bark-tanned leather, I believe, treated with birch tar. And they pulled this leather up after a couple hundred years in the ocean, reconditioned it, and have been making stuff out of it. Isn't that incredible? The stuff is so durable. It's just amazing. And I think the birch tar probably preserved it a lot more than just the tannin. But, I'll throw pieces of bark tanned leather in my compost all the time, and I just always keep sifting out the same pieces over and over, and I throw them back and they're still there the next year and the year after that. Eventually they start to decay, but even in that environment, which is like the thing you set, like a compost pile is the thing you set up to rot stuff quickly and efficiently and definitively, right? And they still don't break down in there. It's incredible. Pretty neat story. So on Rawhide, this is another, again, Plains Indian art of painting on skin. It was done not just by the Plains, but down into the Southwest and over into what's called the Plateau, which is like the drier part of the Northwest. The Plateau had a lot in common with the Plains Indian cultures. Anyway, this is mostly an art book, again, with these beautiful plates of a traditional parfleche. So parfleche usually refers, I mean, it's kind of a vague term, but it usually refers to painted rawhide containers. Now these are like an Indian suitcase is what they often say. Here's a couple that I've made. So this, for instance, and then you close it and you tie it closed. Kind of looks like a big pillow. And they were usually made in pairs to carry on either side of a horse. So that, you know, you'd have one matching paintings that go on either side of the horse. And then these type of envelopes were also very common. Both of these are made from elk skin. A lot of them are made with buffalo. They're made with horse, elk, moose, and later with cow, which does not work well at all. But some of them are also stiff, and there's like these. These are like stiff containers. Cowhide works okay for that. But after a while, cow is all that people had access to, so they kept this art alive, doing it with cowhides and then selling these as tourist items, and that's ironically how the art survived. Between the information in this book and a few other references, I was able to figure out how to do this, but it's very vague, and there's a difference between getting a piece of skin and just painting on it and doing the traditional parfleche, and especially making functional parfleche that you can actually use for stuff, because I can tell you a lot of the stuff in this book is actually not even functional. It was basically art that was made for sale. Like that one's functional, I can tell. And I've examined some old parfleche in person, and it's not just that they're dried up, it's that they're made with cowhide, and that's just not a good material. I love that one there. I love that. This is an incised buffalo sheath, knife sheath. So buffalo has this colored epidermis, and it's cut off in spots to leave patterns. Anyway, I've taught this a little bit and written about it a little bit. We'll talk about it more sometime. It's a really fascinating art. And I guess finally, making the Atikamekw snowshoe. This book is incredible. It is just an exhaustive study and documentation of this process, from choosing the tree, the traditional, knives that they use, and it's an incredible art. I mean, look at these snowshoes. This webbing is so fine. It's just like this super, super fine stitching. Look at that. Incredible. Hello. Hello. Look at that. Look at that. I can't take it. It's killing me. Yeah, preparing the hide, everything. I was in a bookstore one day, and I was just browsing. I didn't have that much money, but it was a used bookstore, and I was always in bookstores looking around at stuff. And I saw this book, and I immediately went out on the street and begged for money from people. I panhandled on the street for about an hour until I had enough money to buy this book. And I was out there, can you spare change so I can buy a book? Because that's what I was doing. Hilarious. And it worked. Some nice people gave me 50 cents here and $1 there until I had enough. I think I had maybe $5 or $6 with me, and it was I think it was $15, because I was like, I'm not walking out of this store without this book, right? And I'm really glad that I did that, because it is absolutely an incredible book. Like, so few books document things this well. And that's because this guy is acting both as kind of an anthropologist to record this art, but he's also actually does this kind of stuff. So he knows what he's looking at, he knows what's important and how important it is to document this stuff in detail. So the skin is prepared in typical Northern Indian fashion by drying and or freezing the skin on a frame or flat, and then it's scraped while it's frozen, which is real typical. They don't always do that. Sometimes it's just dry, and it's scraped to a consistent thickness all around. and then it's cut in spirals into this, you know, these long spirals of really fine rawhide, and then it's used to weave these amazing snowshoes. So that, you know, process of preparing the hide is recorded fairly exhaustively for what, you know, you usually see. So that's it. As much as I'd like to be selling my book right now to you, it's out of print, and I know Tamara's already done a lot of the preparatory work that we need to do on finding all the photographs and getting the illustrations and stuff all together, making sure we have all that stuff, because the old plates and art, you know, layout was lost and we have to lay out the whole thing all over again. My job will be starting to go through here and making revisions, deciding how many revisions to make and all that stuff. And eventually we'll get this back out on the market, and it will be in digital and print versions. A viewer offered to help us put it into digital version just as a thank you for, you know, doing my channel and what I do, and that's really awesome. I'm real excited about that. You'll hear more about that whenever it happens. And in the meantime, if you've already read my book, consider leaving us a review on Amazon. Thank you for watching, and we'll be doing some more videos like this on other book genres, maybe like outdoor bush living type stuff, and who knows what. You know, I've got old books on different topics, quite the collection of books. Later.